My wife said he was just a friend. Now she's pregnant and won't say who the father is. I am a 32-year-old man, and the first time my wife told me she was pregnant, she refused to look me in the eyes. She stood by the sink, one hand on the counter, the other on her stomach like a protective reflex, and said it in a voice so calm I almost missed the meaning. I remember waiting for joy to wash over me, waiting for the cliché scene where we hug and plan names. Instead, a cold, quiet thought walked into the room and sat down. We hadn't been intimate in months. I didn't say that out loud. I asked how far along. She said 8 weeks. I did the math automatically and felt my chest compress. 8 weeks earlier, she had spent 3 nights at her friend's place to help with a breakup. That friend, a guy named Lucas from her office, had been hovering around our life for half a year. Group drinks that turned into late-night texts. Errands that somehow included him. A tone in my wife's voice when she said his name that I told myself I imagined. Every time I asked who he was exactly, she laughed it off and said he was just a friend who needed someone to talk to. I tried to be the reasonable husband that day. I said we should call a doctor, schedule the first appointment, plan the next steps. She said she'd handle it. She said she had already done a test at a clinic near her office and everything looked fine. Then she added a sentence too casual to be innocent. We shouldn't tell anyone yet. I asked why. She said stress wasn't good for the baby. It sounded like a line from a leaflet, not like her. When she went to shower, I stood in the hall feeling like the floorboards had shifted a few millimeters, enough to make you doubt your balance, but not enough to prove it to anyone. 2 days later, my mother called. She had heard from someone at church that my wife was expecting. I learned that my wife had told her hairdresser, who had told a neighbor, who had told my mother. My mother cried with happiness and asked me if I was ready. I lied and said yes. That night, my wife came home late with the same tired smile she had been wearing all month. She said the clinic had given her vitamins and a schedule. I asked to see. She said she left the papers at work. I offered to pick her up the next day and go together. She said that wouldn't be necessary. I didn't sleep. I lay there remembering all the small oddities I had folded into busy season and bad moods. The second phone I found in the laundry basket 2 months ago that she said belonged to a coworker. The Uber receipts at 1:40 a.m. that she said were a driver's mistake. The weekend she volunteered with a charity I'd never heard of, coming back on Sunday with a sweatshirt that smelled like a hotel hallway. The way she had moved my hands away from her when I tried to hug her from behind last month and said she was overstimulated. I'd accepted all of it because marriage, I thought, meant believing the version of reality your partner asked you to believe. In the morning, I opened our joint laptop and checked the browser history. It was clean, too clean, but the download folder wasn't. A week-old PDF sat there with a generic name. It was a prenatal intake form, the template used by a clinic across town, not the one near her office. It listed support person, none. The field for the last menstrual. Period placed conception around a weekend. She said she had spent with her friend Mia. My eyes kept bouncing to the signature line where she had signed with her maiden name, instead of the married one she otherwise used. People do that sometimes out of habit, or they do it when they don't want a search to connect dots. On Friday, I went to our neighbor, a retired nurse named Helen, to borrow a drill and to ask an unrelated question that wasn't unrelated at all. Her doorbell camera faced the street. I asked if I could see last month's footage from the weekend in question because we'd had a package stolen, which was true 2 months earlier. She sighed about crime and scrolled through the clips. At 2:12 a.m. on that Saturday, my wife walked up our path with a man. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But she turned toward him with the intimacy of people who don't need to touch to be understood. He kept his face angled away from the camera, hood up. The shape could have been any man in his 30s. The way he moved felt familiar. I thanked Helen and left with the drill I didn't need. I decided to ask directly that night. My wife sat at the table with her laptop open, a spreadsheet of deadlines and client names. I told her I'd seen the clinic form and the camera clip. I said I needed to know whose child she was carrying. She looked at me like I'd committed a betrayal worse than any I could accuse her of. She said I was controlling, paranoid, making a pregnancy about myself. She said I had been distant for months, buried in work, not noticing her stress or her sadness. Some of that was true. I had taken on more hours to cover debts we never used to have. But the debts came from somewhere, and the somewhere had a first name and a phone I never saw. When I insisted, she said the ugliest sentence I'd ever heard from her mouth. "You'll know when I want you to know." In the morning, a message pinged on my phone from an unknown number. It said, "Check the storage unit, back wall." Folder marked August. We had a small unit we used when we moved, mostly boxes of books and an old sofa. I drove there with my stomach turning. In the back, behind a lamp wrapped in a blanket, I found a plastic file box labeled by months. In the August folder, there were printed emails and screenshots from a messaging app with disappearing texts. I recognized my wife's profile picture. The other name was L. The tone was all the intimacy that the doorbell camera hadn't shown. They talked about being careful, about burning bridges calmly, about timelines. They talked about a late period and a test and a second test. My wife wrote that she would handle the home situation and that she didn't want to be pressured about leaving papers on. Tables. L wrote that he respected her. Boundaries, and then asked for a photo of the test anyway. She sent it. The corner of our bathroom sink was visible in the frame. I sat on the unit's concrete floor with the folder open on my knees until my legs went numb. I took photos of every page with shaking hands. I didn't tell anyone. Part of me wanted to walk home and put the pages on the kitchen table and force the future to arrive. Another part understood that if I did that, I would be the explosion she would later blame for everything. So I did something small and quiet instead. I called a therapist whose card I had stuffed in a drawer months earlier when the company offered free sessions. I booked an appointment for Monday. It felt ridiculous, like bringing a glass of water to a building on fire, but it was an action I could own. On Sunday, my wife suggested we tell my sister, Claire. She framed it like a diplomatic gesture, something to show me that she wasn't hiding. We drove to my sister's house with a cake and a smile that felt stitched onto my face. Claire cried and hugged us both. Her husband, Tom, clapped my back too hard like men do when they don't know what to say. Then somewhere between tea and congratulations, Claire asked me how I felt, really. I told her I was happy and scared. I looked at my wife and tried to mean it. My wife squeezed my hand on top of my knee, a public gesture we hadn't shared in months. For a second, I almost allowed myself the warmth of that lie. That night, I found a letter on my pillow. It was an ultrasound photo with a neon post-it. The note said, 12W plus 3D. I counted again. 12 weeks and 3 days didn't match what she had told me. It matched the earlier weekend, the one with just a friend who needed her to stay over because he was a mess. I turned the photo over. On the back, the technician had scribbled the clinic name and the patient ID. There was no patient name. I Googled the clinic. It specialized in discrete services and executive scheduling. My wife had said the first appointment was near her office. This clinic was nowhere near there. The next morning, a notification popped up on our joint banking app. A deposit from a limited company I didn't recognize landed in our account 2 weeks earlier. An even number, the kind you'd use when you don't want questions. The reference line said consulting. My wife doesn't consult. She is an events manager for a mid-size firm. I looked up the company name. It was a shell with a mailbox address. The director's name was Lucas. I confronted her after work. I didn't shout. I wasn't noble. I was just tired. I asked her if the baby was mine. She said biology wasn't the only thing that made a father. She said what mattered was who showed up. She said her private medical decisions were not a courtroom. I told her that if she wouldn't tell me, a test would. She crossed her arms and told me that tests could wait and that stress wasn't good for pregnancy. I asked about the transfer from the shell company. She said it was a prize for an internal competition she had won. The lie was lazy. She had never been lazy before. The next day, she moved into the guest room to sleep better. I heard her whispering on the phone after midnight more than once. I stopped touching the food she cooked and started eating at my desk at work. I told myself I wasn't being dramatic. I was being careful. I changed the password on our Wi-Fi and watched which devices asked to join. A new phone pinged. I blocked it. She told me I was being childish. I said I was tired of paying for secrets. A week later, I received a formal letter from a lawyer representing Lucas's company. It was a cease and desist about defamatory assumptions. I hadn't written anything, posted anything, said anything to anyone beyond my therapist. The letter existed to say, "We know you're getting close." My therapist asked me what I actually wanted. I said I wanted the truth even if it destroyed me. He said the truth usually does its damage early so it can teach you later. On Friday, I got another anonymous text. "If you want proof, check the town hall records. Day use room 3B. Noon." I thought it was a joke, but I went anyway. The clerk pointed me to a public terminal. There, under permits and bookings, I found a reservation for a private room 12 weeks ago. The names were my wife's and Lucas's. The description said mediation. I asked the clerk what that meant. She said sometimes people book rooms to sign papers with witnesses for personal matters. She shrugged like it was boring. I printed the page. I sat in my car afterward and stared at the steering wheel, trying not to cry in a municipal parking lot. At home that evening, the house felt like a waiting room where nobody called my name. My wife placed a stack of baby name books on the coffee table and asked what I liked. I heard myself answer with a name I'd loved since I was a kid. She smiled gently and said we'd see. That night, when she closed the guest room door, an old anger I didn't know I was capable of crawled out of my ribs. I wanted to pound on the door and demand the truth. I didn't. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of a train, thinking of all the seconds that make up a marriage, and how many of them can be stolen quietly without anyone noticing until you do the count. On Saturday morning, the final piece I had been avoiding fell into my hands. Helen knocked and handed me a small envelope. She said a courier had left it for me by mistake, and she recognized my name. Inside was a printed thread of office emails that someone had forwarded from an anonymous account. They were between HR and the CFO, Lucas, about managing rumors and protecting staff privacy. My wife's name appeared twice, once attached to a sabbatical request, once attached to executive discretion. The date of the discretion matched the town hall booking. I set the papers on the table, lined them up so the dates formed a clean chronology, and finally saw the story I'd been trying not to read. It started with just a friend, then moved to a late period, then a secret booking, then a clinic across town, then a company transfer, then a rewrite of reality in which I was expected to nod and hold a hand I hadn't been allowed to hold for months. At noon, before I could decide what to do, my phone buzzed one more time, a message from a number that had never texted me before. It said, "If you want a paternity test after birth, file now. Do not sign anything at the hospital. Do not be fooled by a temporary certificate. He did this to someone else. You are not the first." I read it 3 times, then picked up my keys. I was done being the last person in the room to know my own life. I drove to a family lawyer's office and walked in without an appointment, carrying the folder from the storage unit, the printouts from town hall, the bank transfer, and the HR thread. The receptionist asked if I had a consultation scheduled. I said I didn't. I said I had proof. She saw my hands shake and told me to sit. I did, with the dry taste in my mouth that people get when they've finally decided to light the fuse. The lawyer who met me was a calm woman named Sophie who listened like a recorder. I put the documents on her desk in the order I had built, like a timeline you show a jury. She scanned each page without commentary, only asking me to clarify dates. When she finished, she slid a form toward me and told me to file a petition for a post-birth paternity test and to prepare a notarized declaration stating that I would not sign the initial birth certificate until testing was complete. She said some hospitals push for signatures for administrative efficiency and that once a name is on the certificate, reversing it is possible but messy. She didn't ask me if I wanted to stay married. She asked me if I felt safe at home and if I had a support plan if the situation escalated. I realized I didn't. I said I could sleep at my sister's if needed. She told me to pack a bag quietly and to photograph everything I was keeping. That evening, I packed a small duffel in the bathroom, counting socks like they were decisions. In the mirror, I looked older than I had in the morning. I told my wife I was staying at my sister's for a few nights to give us space. She tilted her head and asked if I was punishing her. I said I was protecting myself. She said distance would only make things worse. I said lies already had. She didn't cry. She said stress was bad for pregnancy again, using the same tone as if she had practiced it. I left with the folder under my arm and the particular heartbreak of locking a door from the outside. At Claire's house, Tom gave me the spare room and pretended not to hear when I took a long shower and stayed under the water until it ran lukewarm. Claire poured tea and asked me to tell her everything. I did, with as few adjectives as possible, because adjectives make pain theatrical and I needed discipline. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said 2 sentences that mattered. The first, I wasn't crazy. The second, I didn't have to carry the story alone anymore. The next morning, Sophie emailed a draft of the petition and the declaration. I signed both and scanned them back. By noon, the court had stamped the filing. By 3 p.m., the hospital liaison had my declaration on file. It felt like loading sandbags before a forecast flood. At 5 p.m., I received an email from HR at my wife's company, copied to my personal address for reasons I can't explain other than that someone inside had a conscience. It summarized a rumor mitigation plan, instructing staff not to discuss private matters and listing contacts for media inquiries. My wife's name wasn't on it, but the subtext was fluorescent. On Wednesday, the dam broke publicly. Someone posted anonymously on an office forum that the CFO had a pattern of relationships with subordinates. They described a tactic: emotional support during high-stress projects, invitations framed as therapy, then secrecy masked as professionalism. They wrote that one woman had left last year quietly with a settlement. Lucas responded in a company-wide email denying everything and warning of legal action. The tension jumped from private to collective in one click. At home, our home, my wife must have felt the quake. She texted me at 11:23 p.m. asking to talk face-to-face. I met her in a coffee shop at lunchtime the next day because neutral ground felt safer. She looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't lift. She said she didn't want a scene. She said she was confused and scared and that she had made mistakes. She kept the nouns abstract, as if naming the man would make him solid. I told her about the petition and the hospital. Her face hardened. She called it an attack. I called it a boundary. She said biology wasn't destiny. I said names on legal documents are. She asked if I would still be there for the child if it turned out not to be mine. She asked it like a test, like the path back to us required me to step over myself. I told her I couldn't answer that question while I was being lied to. I told her honesty had to come first. She stared at the street and said Lucas loved her, that he was going to leave his wife, that they were serious. She said it heroically, like a person reciting lines she hoped would become true through repetition. I said nothing. She added that she hadn't told me because she didn't want to hurt me. The sentence was absurd enough to be cruel. The next day, Claire called me whispering. Someone had sent her a screenshot of a local gossip page where a blind item described a CFO, an events manager, a husband in denial. The city is small. People can do math. The comments were merciless, which is how strangers eat stories. I felt the humiliation rise like heat. I turned off my phone and went for a long walk until my legs hurt more than my head. Friday afternoon, a beige envelope arrived at Claire's address to me. Inside was a copy of a non-disclosure agreement with my wife's signature and the company letterhead. It offered executive discretion and temporary financial support in exchange for confidentiality regarding interpersonal matters that could harm brand reputation. The amount matched the consulting transfer in our account. There was a second page with a schedule of wellness appointments. The clinic name was the same as the one on the ultrasound. I stared at the signature and thought of our wedding day when we signed something else in front of witnesses, something that asked less of us but meant more. I sent the NDA to Sophie. She replied 10 minutes later in all business. She would add it to our file. She also suggested a protective order preventing the CFO from contacting me directly after the cease and desist stunt. An hour later, another document hit my inbox. An email from a whistleblower at the company saying an internal investigation had started. It mentioned 3 women and a pattern of mentorship that looked like grooming when read side by side. On Sunday, my wife's mother invited us to a small family tea to clear the air. It turned into a tribunal. Her mother lectured me about supporting my wife unconditionally. Her father stared at his shoes. Her sister Olivia asked the question everyone pretended wasn't the question: who is the father? My wife snapped that no one had a right to demand that. I said quietly that the court would. My wife's mother called me heartless. Olivia, who has less tolerance for fantasy than the rest of them, asked my wife if she was leaving me. My wife said she hadn't decided. The room went silent except for a spoon clinking against a cup because someone thought tea could fix language. The next 48 hours were a loop of logistics: work, lawyer calls, printing copies. At night, alone in Claire's spare room, I scrolled through photos of my wife and me on trips where we had shared pizza slices and inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. I tried to locate the moment where the story turned, where friend became future, where I became a placeholder. The line wouldn't appear. It never does. The shift is made of hundreds of small chances to speak honestly that both people let pass. Then came the baby shower. A thing I didn't want, but wasn't allowed not to attend without becoming the villain who abandoned a pregnant woman. It was at my wife's friend's townhouse. Balloons, cupcakes, the polite cruelty of women who used to be our friends. Gifts piled up like votes for a life I no longer had a seat in. Midway through, Lucas arrived. He wasn't on the invite list. He walked in with a bottle of sparkling juice and a grin designed for photos. People looked from him to me and pretended to adjust their sleeves. He hugged my wife in a way that suggested plausible deniability if frozen in a screenshot. He shook my hand like a man greeting a colleague, and I realized he was performing for his own alibi. See how civilized we are? I didn't make a scene. I did something worse for him. I stepped onto the little patio, asked for everyone's attention, and thanked them for coming. Then I said in a level voice that I had filed for a paternity test, that I would not be signing anything at the hospital, and that anyone with advice about sticking it out for optics should save it. Not one person laughed. A few looked at the floor. My wife's friend gasped like the party had lost its soundtrack. My wife's eyes went wide, and she mouthed that I was cruel. Lucas's smile ran out of battery. He put his juice on a table and went inside to take a call that didn't exist. I left, not out of drama, but because the air had become unbreathable. On Monday morning, the company announced that Lucas was taking personal leave. The internal forum said other things. By afternoon, a journalist had emailed me asking for comment. I didn't respond. This was not a victory. It was a mess spreading in all directions, including toward a child who hadn't asked for any of it. 3 weeks later, my wife texted that she was in labor. I drove to the hospital with the petition and the declaration in a folder, feeling like a man bringing contracts to a thunderstorm. At admissions, the nurse asked me to sign the paperwork as the father. I handed her the declaration instead. She raised an eyebrow, then nodded like she'd seen 3 versions of this already this week. In the waiting room, my mother held my hand and told me she was proud of me for being calm. I wasn't calm. I was numb in a way that felt like the body's way of protecting the mind from brightness. Late that night, a midwife told me the baby had arrived and that both mother and child were stable. She asked if I wanted to see the baby. I did, because whatever else was true, a human had been born from the person I used to know best. I looked at the child, tiny, wrinkled, furious with life, and felt a complicated tenderness that wasn't love and wasn't nothing. I whispered a blessing out of habit, the kind my grandmother used to say over new beginnings, and stepped back. My wife asked me in a tired whisper to hold the baby. I said I couldn't until the test. It was a boundary that hurt us both. The test happened the next morning. The lab tech was neutral and quick. My wife didn't look at me while they swabbed. 2 days later, the result arrived like a door closing gently but firmly. Excluded. Not the father. The word was clean and brutal. I sat with it in Claire's kitchen while she made coffee she forgot to drink. I called Sophie. She said she would file the paperwork to finalize the certificate without my name and begin the separation process formally. She asked how I was. I said I was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. My wife texted asking to talk about arrangements. She said I was abandoning her. She said the baby needed stability. She asked again if I could be in his life in some capacity. I asked who the father was, again. She wrote the name this time, Lucas. She added that he had gone quiet since the investigation. She said she didn't want to be alone. I told her she wasn't alone. She had made a choice and could now live inside it. It sounded colder than I felt, but kindness had been the currency that bought me this pain. Weeks went by. Papers were served. Friends sorted themselves into categories. Those who texted, those who disappeared, those who sent long paragraphs about forgiveness from the safety of their intact lives. At work, I threw myself into tasks that had numbers and deadlines. At night, I went to therapy and learned new words for the sad physics of betrayal, cognitive dissonance, intermittent reinforcement, erosion. Some nights, I reread messages from the storage unit and felt a clean anger at the sentences my wife had typed about me as if I were a problem to be managed. Other nights, I remembered our good years and felt grief so quiet, I mistook it for a draft. One afternoon, I ran into Lucas on the street. He looked thinner, less certain. He started to speak, then stopped. He said he hoped I was healing. I said I hoped he was learning to apologize to people whose names he didn't remember. He blinked, then said he would step up. I said stepping up starts with telling the truth without NDAs. He nodded like a man practicing humility for court. The separation hearing was short. Property was divided. I kept the apartment because she moved to a smaller place closer to her mother. There were no custody issues for me, only paperwork to ensure no future claims. The judge looked at me with the tired empathy of a person who sees too many versions of the same story and can save no one from the plot. Now I live in a quieter apartment. The silence is different here. It belongs to me. Some mornings I wake up and feel relief so sharp it almost counts as joy. Other mornings I feel an ache behind my ribs where the idea of a family used to sit. People tell me time will melt the shape of this year into something survivable. Maybe they're right. I don't want the child to grow up thinking he is a scandal. I don't want to be the man who tells a boy that his origin was a lie that stole a house. My wife sent a photo last week of the baby smiling. She wrote that he likes the sound of the washing machine and hates the bath. I stared at the picture for a long time and then put the phone face down. I don't owe anyone a performance of strength. I owe myself a life that doesn't require me to swallow myself whole to keep the peace. If I could speak to the man I was the day she said, "just a friend," I would tell him that small alarms are not disloyal, that you can love someone and still demand that the facts obey gravity. Instead, I'm here, learning to cook for one and to sleep in a bed that no longer argues with me, answering kind messages and deleting curious ones. People ask what I'll do if she asks for forgiveness someday. I don't have an answer. The truth did its damage early, just like my therapist promised. The rest is maintenance, the slow work of building a life around a hole that used to be a home. Some nights I think about the baby's first laugh and the way his face folded like a paper crane. Other nights I think about a doorbell camera catching two silhouettes at 2 a.m., and I know I made the only choice that let me keep a self I recognize. I tell myself, that's enough. On the bad days, I'm not sure.
Follow me for more stories.